You may be young, son, but here, have a wad of cash for existing, no strings attached. And to think that this is less than what I got from each of my tenants last month.
Maybe I can find a box to sleep in tonight. I'm sorry.
For God's sakes, stop being poor!
I'm really
Don't
sorry.
you have a mansion to get a pedicure in? And get a muscle soak in your karaoke-enabled jacuzzi? People like you make me sick! Here, crawl under this box!
Where do I begin when it comes to describing our monopoly society? Let's start off at the beginning of existence, or rather, our existence. We don't choose where we're born, when we're born. We don't choose what kind of family we're born into. We don't choose whether we're born into a home or a homeless situation. And that poses a question. Should we inherit a position in life based on the work and the result of previous generations, and those previous generations already being hindered by an unequal society? Or should certain needs already be met and opportunities available irrespective of the kind of family that you're born into, and every family at its foundation already having access to these opportunities and basic needs like shelter, food, already being met? Should children, for example, inherit the restrictions imposed on previous generations, whether it's class-based discrimination, racial-based discrimination, such as slavery, and those previous generations being hindered to the point where there's a social bottleneck and they cannot pass on the same privileges as other people? Should children, for example, inherit the restrictions and the sufferings of previous generations, even if on paper, by law, these restrictions are no longer in effect? Should children be offered the same opportunities irrespective of your social standing? Should personal ambitions be set aside just for the mere struggle to survive? And this system and its implementation benefiting some people at the expense of other people. I think the late stage monopoly analogy is good for describing this, ever since I did a Instagram TV video in what can be considered a pandemic biffro last year. Anyways, the late stage monopoly effect is when a few people have been playing Monopoly for a certain time, and then you join in many rounds in. But for those who don't know the rules of Monopoly or don't know how relevant it is to this analogy, let me give you an explanation. So you have a few people playing the game and they have a set amount of money to begin with. Each one, turn by turn, rolls the dice and they make their way progressing through a board. You can land on properties, you can land on utilities, train lines, and you can purchase these assets using the money you already have. Once you've purchased these assets, subsequent people who land on those properties have to pay the required rent to the person who owns the assets. Every time you go around the board, you collect a certain amount of money, a certain dividend that can be considered a salary. So in effect, as properties are bought up, other players have to pay rent as soon as they land on it. So it becomes a game of monopolizing assets and purchasing assets as soon as possible, whilst other people diminish their savings as a result. What usually happens is those with assets and properties early enough, whether it's in the case of properties, utility companies, train lines, usually get wealthier at the expense of everyone else in the game. However, in late stage Monopoly, you join many rounds in, and you start off with a smaller amount of money to begin with. Much smaller amount than other players who started off earlier. So let's say this is an analogy to centuries of discrimination laws, slavery, class-based discrimination. So what happens is, as these latecomers come to the game, they have a small amount of money, so they cannot buy the properties that have already been purchased. Furthermore, as the game goes on, people can make further upgrades to the properties they already own, charging more rent for these assets. So it becomes a case of those who arrived at the game late, they not only pay high enough rent that they can barely survive, never mind purchase assets, but their savings are diminished over the long run. So since your salary hasn't compensated for the increase in the costs of living in terms of properties or utilities, there becomes a discrepancy between the salary and your externalities, what you can afford. So then it becomes a case in the real world of people who are too poor to survive borrowing credit. And that poses another problem, because you cannot pass on the assets you buy on credit naturally. So a person lives and dies in debt. What happens is the majority of people scrape by, whilst the landlords, the business owners, reap the wealth. They monopolize the resources, the assets, whilst other people are barely trying to make ends meet. Not only do people who own assets have things that we call cash cows that produce money over the long run in a setting whereby they don't have to do very much. Not only that, but with great wealth comes great power, as lobbying and campaign contributions make their way from the corporations and big business and landlords in the hands of politicians, allowing them to impact policy and increasing their control over democracy and reducing the impact of labour forces to unionize, giving businesses more power and labour forces less. So landlords, business owners reap most of the wealth, and they also impact policy and politics, whilst everyone is barely scraping by. And it's not a surprise that a lot of politicians are from previous business backgrounds. Take Donald Trump, for example, or Nigel Farage, both from business backgrounds. And if they're not previously business owners, the current politicians are definitely in the pockets of the corporations, for the most part. So you have a monopoly society where the majority are scraping by, and you have a monopoly of power and wealth in a very tiny portion of people, less than 1%. Now, I'm not saying we should give up on trying to improve our standing and our status and our ability to produce more wealth. And if you are entrepreneurially minded, I really encourage it. However, not everyone can be an entrepreneur or wants to be. Let's take, for example, the startup costs that come with requiring to start a business. For the most part, it's huge, astronomical, and if you cannot make ends meet, then how are you going to start a business? Not only that, but temperamentally and skill-wise, not everyone can be and wants to be a business owner. Let's not forget that if everyone was a business owner, no business would be more than one person, which doesn't make any sense. And my biggest gripe is with large corporations and big business. So what ends up happening is, even though we are free and equal on paper in terms of laws, the reality is a certain class of people, a segment of society, will have a different dignity, power, and ability to impact politics compared to another class of people. Namely, the corporations have a lot more control, especially since the neoliberal period of the 80s. Through the advent of privitisation of public services through Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and this is a consequence of a capitalistic model that is not properly regulated, and a capitalistic model that does not take into consideration externalities. Never mind climate change, corporate powers do not care about how people are treated and their well-being. Now, obviously things have changed in recent years and there's more of an emphasis on the superficial aspects of well-being. But the bottom line is that corporations want to keep people in their jobs and doing as much as possible for a little amount of money. And it's not a surprise that corporations in the US are having a hard time trying to re-recruit following the pandemic, with their minimum wage not high enough to stir people into action, even though people are barely scraping by as it is with a job. We interrupt your video with Mr Rupeebags' valuable life advice for plebeians and foreigners.
Do you mind sparing some change for shelter, please?
Dare I say, if you're homeless, why not think about buying a house with a low interest mortgage?
Now, I'm not cynical, as in I do not believe it's impossible for people to climb up the social ladder, but it's become progressively harder since the 80s, with a restriction on labour forces and the wages kept low enough so that people cannot make savings to pass on to the next generation. To give you an explanation, let's take person A, who's born into wealth, and they've got a very significant and adequate level of savings, enough to pursue whatever dream they want. And then you have person B, same exact person, same skills, same work ethic, but slight twist, born into a poor family. Now over time, invariably, inevitably, you'll see that person B doesn't make it as far or as high as person A. In fact, person B might be stuck in a situation similar to their parents. And this is true. One's social mobility, whether one can move up in the social ladder relative to one's parents' income and their social status, is much lower in the UK and the US, these more neoliberalized countries, compared to countries like Denmark and other more social democratic countries. Because salary is kept stagnant and it isn't matching the rise in rent, as we've seen with the monopoly game, and the cost of items matching inflation. What happens is people are barely scraping by, not having enough savings to be able to pass on to the next generation, not enough savings to pursue educational attainment or change jobs. It's almost a comedy in how ludicrous this is. So all the wealth that is created by labour forces is pulled back into the system, which in turn makes a certain class of people richer. That doesn't seem like a free and fair situation. Furthermore, because of this salary-based bottleneck, where people are stagnant within their classes and people not able to make more money than their parents, what happens is people are stuck on credit, in that they have to borrow money to make ends meet. what ends up happening is a stratification of people based on their earnings, otherwise known as class. And this is reflected in the class dynamics of people who are in high enough position. This explains why there's a disproportionate amount of people who come from rich families who end up becoming MPs, journalists, judges, people who have a significant impact on society, as opposed to the majority of people who enter these professions at much lower rate. Not saying it's impossible, but that just goes to show the class dynamics that are inherited. Of course, there's a generalization, and I believe that one should pursue their dreams to the highest regard and try and do whatever they can within their means. But of course, not making their life a misery, but also having stable housing, sustenance as a bare minimum. Now, a lot of people who do come from these more privileged situations forget their background when it comes to boasting about what they've achieved. For example, Donald Trump, he made his millions, maybe billions, based on the very tiny loans that he got from his father, to the tune of 60 to 400 million. Now, I don't doubt that Donald Trump is a good salesman, but depending on his father's income, he could have been a car used salesman or a millionaire, depending on the kind of availability of loans and the opportunities that are available to him at a very young age. What you have is a class bottleneck where different classes are competing for personal interest. Take, for example, the multi-billion-dollar and pound industry in focusing on personal responsibility at the cost of trying to change politics. You see, it's a very easy way to get people to focus on what they can change rather than what politicians should change to make the society a little bit more fairer. Because as the game is played right now, people live and die based on their social standing that is inherited. So if you want to actually address the inequalities, whether it's racial, whether it's class-based, and opportunities available to all, then you have to address the foundational aspects of society. Should people be making money at the expense of others? Literally. This class-based bottleneck also creates a situation, in addition to MPs, judges, journalists all having strong imprint based on their upbringing of being from rich families. Instead of having a meritocracy, you have a government by the wealthy, otherwise known as a plutocracy. A government that is ruled and owned by the wealthy creates a situation where democratic interests are constantly being eroded to benefit the corporate classes. Instead of a government that is at the behest of the people, which it should be, it seesaws between the needs of their constituents, their voters, and corporate interests. Take, for example, the Flint water crisis, where in Flint, Michigan, the predominantly African American population suffered from a poor management of their water supply. The local government there switched from the pristine waters of a lake to a river in order to cut costs following the recession. So what happened was, because they did it in a rush and they didn't really necessarily care about the effect of doing this, they didn't take the time to check whether the pipes that they changed to, the old pipes from the early 20th century, didn't leak lead, for example. And as it happens, these very old pipes leaked lead, creating a situation where around 12,000 children got poisoned. So what happened to the water from the lake? Well, they serviced GM, General Motors, a multi-billion-dollar company, after they complained that the water from the river was corroding their car park. All the while, the almost powerless working class African Americans were complaining about water being foul-smelling brown stained water, giving them skin rashes amongst a whole host of different symptoms. And the treatment of the water itself from the river was so poorly done that there was an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, which infected more than 90 people and killed more than a dozen. Calls were ignored even after public offices changed their water source to bottled water, and insisting that the water was safe to drink by the public. Since the scandal broke out, it's been largely rectified, although there are still thousands of lead pipes still in service. Situations like this, where there's an outbreak of lead-infused water or disease, is not uncommon in the poorest segments of society, even within the most richest countries on earth. This is a symptom of the devouring nature of unregulated capitalism and politicians working at the behest of corporations and the financial books, which at the end of the day benefits corporations more than the most powerless people in society. Take, for example, the Grenfell fire, which sadly took the lives of 72 people. Now, this was after months and years even of people complaining and suggesting that the cladding that they're using was unsafe. However, it was a cheap way to make the tower look presentable amidst its more richer, more posher environment. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the government is really good at swaying public opinion through marketing and campaigning, but it's not very good at being at the behest of the public when lives are on the line, especially if you're from a poorer, less powerful segment of society. Take, for example, the Tory government's failed test and trace program, which was resting on £22 billion worth of contracts, many of which were untendered in an uncompetitive market. In other words, contracts were given to people, associates, friends of politicians, without necessarily being fit for the job. And so they're unable to prevent a second wave of COVID in the UK, killing thousands more. But that's not it. Let's talk about how these politicians got into power in the first place. Let's talk about cultural wars. Since these politicians don't necessarily have the best interests of their voter base in mind, they use the hook of a cultural war to hook people into action and voting for them. Instead of funding essential infrastructure and services, they use racist tropes and right-wing populist messaging to get people to vote for them, such as this conservative ad, or riding a wave of anti-immigrant sentiments, which is of course published in the privatized media, and creating the phenomenon of Brexit, or obscuring complex ideas such as critical race theory, as is the focus of the GOP in America in their campaigning for 2022 elections. Of course, they don't understand or care to understand about these complex issues, intersectionality, but it obscures one's understanding, especially in the minds of disaffected white working class voters. They won't provide them essential services, but they will gaslight and manipulate them into voting for them. One of the tropes of which that they use to hook the disaffected working class voters is the hook of freedoms being taken away by the other. In recent times, there's the freedom of one's democratic rights and one's ability to speak their mind in the anti-cancel culture narrative, which I'll create another video on in the future because it's been highly politicized to the point where the history has been ignored. Not saying that cancel culture is something that we should ignore, but it's something that is highly polarized, and it's taken on a life of its own, scaremongering people in saying that their freedoms are being taken away, while simultaneously insisting on a more fascistic form of government is ironic, because the most fairer, more freer societies in the world are also the ones that have a socially democratic society. The less of an emphasis on these cultural wars and these more authoritarian sentiments. These socially democratic countries of Europe also have a more stronger social and welfare safety net for the most disadvantaged people of society. So why do conservatives push for a reduction in welfare services in the name of freedom? Well, it does actually increase freedom for the corporations, that is. Deregulation, for example, is a form of freedom. But this deregulation also causes things like the Grenfell fire. It also causes things like the Flint water crisis. So it's freedom for those corporations that are making money. I don't know how free somebody is if they're getting poisoned by deregulated water supply or from a block that's on fire. I don't know if you have very much freedom in that regard. So it's an increase in freedom in a specific class of people, whereas everyone else just suffers. Oh, and a reduction in their welfare services also means a reduction in taxation for the hyper-rich. So it's a double kill, as it were. A reduction in the red tape that prevents corporations from making money at the expense of the everyday person, but also pay less taxes, which is a win-win for the most corporate and the most corrupt elites. Not saying all are corrupt, but it is a corrupt system. And these more socially democratic countries, they have a greater human democratic index, greater freedom of the press index. So it's not true that the more right-wing libertarian propagandists say that the more free countries are also the more deregulated markets. That's not true. A society in which people are barely scraping by or at the behest of broken infrastructure is not a free society for these people. It's a free society for those corporations that are making money at their cost. So the most disadvantaged people in society, at the mercy of a crisis whereby they are disadvantaged far more than corporate elites, and in turn corporations are bailed out more likely than the everyday person. In other words, it's socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the everyday person, as quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. Since salaries haven't budged very much since the 70s and 80s, and everything is rising in cost, there's been an over-reliance on credit to cover living costs, because otherwise you'd just not survive. And this poses another problem. You see, the 2008 financial crash was due to credit being more freely available, a deregulated market, whereby people were offered credit that they could not afford. What then happened as a result of this deregulation and credit being available to people who couldn't afford it, you had the financial crash, which in turn created a situation where thousands upon thousands of people had their homes foreclosed, many thousands lost their jobs, poverty, homelessness increased, and to add salt in the wound, the government imposed austerity cuts to cover the cost of the loss. That of course was created by the corporations that were in turn bailed out. If that's not a great exemplar how priorities of government lie, and I don't know what is. So as a result of these austerity cuts, it's impacted society as a whole, since austerity has led to an increase of knife crime due to a reduction in police officers. It's increased child poverty by 600,000 children. It's doubled food banks between 2013 and 2017. All the whilst, the banks and the financial institutions that caused the crash were more or less bailed out, especially the much larger banks. Now, I'm not saying these monopolists, these corporate elites, are evil in of themselves. They're merely taking advantage of a system that is easily corruptible. We interrupt your video with a testimonial from a beloved fan of Mr Rupeebags. My name is Vladimir Petrodishka, and whenever I have problem, I seek to advice from Mr Rupeebags' books. I will attempt to pull myself by the bootstraps, as he always suggests, in order to be successful like him, and give you video proofing that anyone can be successful like him. I will attach to the email. I will make attempt now to pull myself up by bootstraps. I believe in positivity, hope, and being my own man. I'll be success. I'll make it happen. Positive vibes always. It's obvious that the principles of human dignity, freedom, justice, equality will not be truly realized in a situation such as this easily monopolized society. Yes, freedom is realizable, but there are degrees of freedom. You don't have a lot of freedom if you're barely scraping by. You don't have the opportunities to take advantage of situations that take full advantage of your skills and talents and abilities. You are bottlenecked by the society in of itself, where you have competing class interests working against each other, and there isn't a solution that works to everyone's benefit, that allows everyone to have their basic needs met with opportunities available to all, while still allowing for the positive aspects of capitalism, until we have a situation where people are free to be themselves and pursue their dreams without worrying about their basic needs being met. Then we won't have such an equal footing for everyone on the ground. And I'll end with this. The Monopoly board game was actually inspired by another game called the Landlord's Game, which was based on Georgist principle. Basically, Georgism, coined by Henry George, proposed the idea that natural resources was in the public ownership. We all owned the land. Instead of landlords monopolizing the land and taking full advantage of it, that land was taxed, so that in effect people would be paid a dividend, or citizens' dividend, otherwise known as a universal basic income, from the profits made on the land, whether it's in the form of landlords owning property, or utilities such as water and gas utilities owned by corporations. That money would eventually go back into the everyday person's pockets, which is a fairer system. And even though I don't consider myself a Georgist, it seems like a fairer system than the one that we have right now, where natural resources are in the hands of private enterprise in large number of cases. In a future video, I'll talk about how studies into universal basic income are shedding old stereotypes regarding homelessness, drug use, educational attainment, and the capacity of humans to achieve once they've had their needs met. If you give people a chance, then they thrive, but you need to give them the chance in the first place. We need to rethink the monopoly model, give people a chance to pursue their dreams whilst also having their basic needs met, while still having the freedom and the opportunity to pursue entrepreneurial enterprise, whilst not ignoring externalities and people within our nation. Thanks for watching. Please give it a like, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And my next videos will be along the lines of universal basic income, but also cancel culture and the situation that is happening across the world, from India and its poor pandemic response, as well as Israel-Gaza situation. Stay tuned.